There is a grade in eastern Nebraska that freight crews have climbed 10,000 times without a second thought. Loaded trains roll up at westbound, throttles open, the diesels doing what diesels do. It is not a mountain. It is barely a hill. On most days, it is nothing at all. On one summer evening a few years ago, it was everything. A westbound freight came to a stop it was never supposed to make. Somewhere up front, a locomotive faltered. The kind of fault that turns thousands of horsepower into dead weight. In the time it takes a warning light to blink on, the rest of the unit strained against the load and lost. The wheels turned, then they didn't. And once a heavy train stalls on a grade, it does not simply gather itself and go again. Behind it, the schedule started to come apart. Other trains stacked up on the line. A dispatcher reached for the radio. What answered the call had no business being on that railroad at all. It was older than the highway running beside the tracks. It had been retired before anyone in that cab was born, towed off to a museum, and left to sit behind a chain-link fence for half a century. The industry had a single, dismissive word for machines like it: obsolete. That word was about to look very foolish. To understand how a relic ended up rescuing the exact technology that had buried it, you have to go back to the moment it was written off in the first place. Because nothing about this machine was ever small, including the way the world decided it was finished. Picture the thing itself. Longer than 2 city buses parked end to end. Heavier than a fully loaded jumbo jet. 16 driving wheels taller than a grown man, split into 2 sets under a single hinged frame so the whole enormous body could bend through a curve without tearing up the rails. A firebox so large it needed its own 4-wheel truck just to hold it off the ground. When it was built, in the early 1940s, it was the largest and most powerful steam locomotive ever to turn a wheel, and only a couple dozen of them were ever made. They were built for one brutal job. Out west, freight had to be dragged over a long, punishing mountain grade, and the railroad was tired of coupling 2 and 3 engines together just to get a single train over the top. So, it ordered a locomotive that could do the work alone. The result was a machine that could put something like 7,000 horsepower to the rail and haul thousands of tons up a mountain at a walking man's idea of speed, then hold 60 on the flats without breaking a sweat. Crews gave it a nickname that stuck, and the nickname said, everything. This was the big one, the heavyweight. The end of the line for how large a steam engine could reasonably get. For a while, it was king. And then, almost overnight, it wasn't. The thing that killed it didn't roar. It hummed. Diesel locomotives arrived and quietly rewrote every rule the steam era had lived by. A steam engine was a demanding animal. It had to be woken up hours before it could work, its fire built slowly, its boiler coaxed up to pressure. It drank water constantly and had to stop every 100 miles or so to refill. It ate coal by the ton and left a trail of ash and cinders behind it. And it could not run for long without an army of people tending to it. Machinists, boilermakers, water tenders, men who knew the sound of a bearing about to go. A diesel asked for almost none of that. You turned a key and it started. It ran far between fill-ups. It didn't need a line-side chain of water towers and coaling stations strung across the country like beads on a wire. And here was the part that made the accountants fall in love. You could couple several diesels together and run them all from a single cab, one engineer commanding the strength of 4 or 5 units at once. No extra crews, no second locomotive with its own fireman, just one person and a throttle. The math was merciless. Steam was said to demand roughly 3 hours of maintenance for every hour it spent earning its keep. Diesels slashed that. The sprawling, expensive infrastructure that kept steam alive, the water stops, the roundhouses, the coal towers, all of it suddenly looked like a museum of overhead. Railroads didn't retire steam because they were sentimental about it. They retired it because a spreadsheet told them to, and the spreadsheet was right. For a machine built for a world of fire and water and coal smoke, there was no place left to stand. The last of the giants made its final revenue run just after midnight in the summer of 1959. No ceremony, no crowds. A handful of railroaders watching a legend rumble into the yard and go cold. Within a couple of years, the entire class was gone. Pulled from service, their fires dropped for good. Most were cut up for scrap, their steel melted down and poured into whatever came next. A lucky few were spared, handed off to museums and city parks to sit as monuments to an age that had already ended. One of them went to a fairground in Southern California. It had covered more than 1 million miles in its working life, hauling freight over that mountain grade season after season, and when it arrived at the museum, its fire went out and stayed out. Visitors could climb into the cab and wrap a hand around a throttle that would never move again. Children grew up seeing it as a static curiosity, a big dark shape behind a fence, something their grandfathers talked about. A plaque told you what it had been. Nothing told you it could ever be anything again, because nobody believed it could. For half a century, it slept. And then, near the end of 2012, the railroad that had built it announced something that stopped the entire preservation world cold. It wanted the machine back, not as a display, as a running locomotive. The idea bordered on absurd. This was not a matter of a fresh coat of paint and an oil can. The knowledge required to operate one of these things had largely died with the men who once did it. The parts didn't exist. The fuel it was built to burn had become a liability on a modern railroad, where a stray cinder from a coal fire could start a grass blaze along hundreds of miles of dry right-of-way. To bring the giant back, the crew would have to solve problems the original designers never faced, using answers those designers never imagined. The hardest of those problems was the fire itself. The locomotive had been born to burn coal, and its firebox was a cavern built for exactly that. The obvious move was to convert it to oil, cleaner and far easier to handle on today's rails. But that road had been tried before, and it had failed. Decades earlier, during a coal strike, the railroad had converted one of these same engines to burn oil as an experiment. The trouble was the sheer size of the firebox. A single oil burner couldn't spread its heat evenly across that vast space. The fire pooled and starved, hot in one place and cold in another, and the conversion was judged a failure. After a couple of years, that engine went back to coal. So, the restoration team had to do what history said couldn't be done. They designed a new floor for the fire, a heavy steel pan, and set a single burner at its heart. Oil fed in and was blasted into a fine mist with steam. Air was fed in precisely where the flame needed it. A wall of fire brick caught the first punch of heat and spread it through the whole chamber, so that instead of a fire that burned bright in one corner and dead in another, the entire box glowed with an even, steady heat. What had defeated the engineers of an earlier generation was finally solved by a crew working from the same old blueprints with a better plan. But burning cleanly was only half the fight. To share track with modern trains, the antique had to meet modern safety law. That meant fitting it with the electronics that watch a train's speed and position, and can bring it to a stop on their own if a rule is broken. So the crew threaded microprocessors and radio antennas into a cab built before the Second World War, wiring a computer into a machine that predated the transistor. When a part couldn't be bought, a machinist made it from scratch, matching dimensions down to a fraction of a hair. Rod brasses, valve gear, air compressors, all of it either rebuilt or recreated by hand. 5 years of that work went by. And then, on a spring day in 2019, steam filled the shop air for the first time in nearly 60 years. Pressure climbed. The crew stood along the rails, some of them wiping their eyes, and watched as the engineer eased the throttle forward. The exhaust barked, the great drivers turned, and the machine that everyone had agreed was finished rolled out into the daylight under its own power. It was alive again, but it was still, in the eyes of the world, a beautiful antique, a show pony, a thing to be photographed and admired, hauling a short string of passenger cars on ceremonial runs while a diesel tagged along behind, quietly ready to take over if the old giant ever needed rescuing. That's the assumption I want you to hold in your head, because in Nebraska, it was about to be turned completely inside out. If you're enjoying this one, take a second to subscribe. We dig into locomotive history and the engineering behind the machines every single week. Now, that summer evening, and that grade in eastern Nebraska, the giant hadn't gone out there to prove anything. It had been on tour, put on display in a nearby city for a major event, drawing the usual crowds who came to stand next to something so large it doesn't quite fit in memory. With the appearances done, it was simply heading home, running light across the plains, no great load behind it. Ordinary, uneventful. And then, up ahead on the same railroad, a modern freight stalled on that hill. A string of diesels, the current generation of motive power, the very kind of locomotive that had made the giant obsolete in the first place, sat dead on the grade with a mechanical problem and a heavy train. They could no longer move. The line was blocked. Traffic was backing up. And the one machine close enough to help was the 80-year-old relic that everyone had written off. The call went out. Bring the steam engine. What happened next was captured by a rail fan standing trackside with a camera, and the footage would be watched by millions. You can see the giant come creeping up behind the stranded train, black and gleaming, easing toward the rear of the consist. You hear the couplers meet. There's a pause, the whole scene holding its breath. Then the fireman opens the valve wider, the pressure surges, and the engineer leans on the throttle. For a heartbeat, the massive drivers slip. Steel shrieks against steel, all that weight and power fighting for grip on the rail. And then they catch. The exhaust erupts into a deep, rolling thunder that you can feel through the ground, and the giant begins to push. Slowly, the couplers stretch tight the length of the stalled train. Slowly, the whole dead weight of it begins to move. Picture the crew in that cab for a second. These are people who spend their days babying a priceless machine, easing it gently around excursion routes, never asking it for more than a light load and a photogenic plume of steam. Now, suddenly, they're being asked for everything. You can imagine the fireman watching the pressure gauge, the engineer feeling the driver's bite and hold, both of them realizing at the same moment that the old giant has it, that it's not straining, that it could do this all day. For about 20 minutes, an antique steam locomotive shoved a modern diesel freight up a grade that the modern diesels could not climb on their own. It banked them over the top and set the whole railroad moving again. The technology that had been declared dead pushed the technology that replaced it up a hill, and it did it without drama, without straining, doing exactly the job it was designed to do more than 3/4 of a century earlier. The video went viral within hours, and no wonder. There is something almost mythical about it, a story so neat it feels invented. The machine the industry threw away comes roaring back, to rescue the machine that threw it away. Now, let's be honest about what this was and what it wasn't. Nobody is arguing the railroad should mothball its diesel fleet and go back to steam. Sending a hand-restored, one-of-a-kind steam locomotive out to bank a stalled freight is not efficient, and it will never be standard practice. On paper, it makes no sense at all. A single one of these steam giants burns fuel and demands attention in ways no modern railroad would ever accept as routine. But that's not the point, and it was never the point. The point is that when the moment came, the old machine could still do the work. Not as a symbol, not as a stunt, as raw, functional muscle, exactly the kind of low-speed, heavy drag pulling it was born for. Steam engines are at their most stubborn and most powerful, precisely when they're grinding a huge load up a grade at slow speed. That's the terrain where this locomotive was king in the first place. So when a diesel died on a hill, it turned out that the tool for the job had been sitting in that consist all along, disguised as a museum piece. There's a deeper lesson buried in there, and it has nothing to do with trains. We are quick to call things obsolete. We retire them, replace them, roll them off to the back lot, and move on, certain that newer means better, and that better means the old thing has nothing left to offer. And usually we're right. Progress is real, and the diesels earned their victory honestly. But every so often, the thing we declared finished turns out to have a capability the replacement never quite matched, a strength so specific we forgot it existed until the exact moment we needed it. The giant didn't come back because it was efficient. It came back because someone chose to keep it. Because a crew spent 5 years and countless hours solving problems that history said were unsolvable, refusing to let a machine die just because the world had moved on. Preservation isn't nostalgia. It's insurance against the arrogance of assuming we'll never need the old ways again. So the next time you pass a rusting machine behind a fence, an old engine, an outdated tool, something the world has agreed is finished, hold off on the word obsolete for a moment. Look a little longer at what it was built to do. Because obsolete only means we've stopped needing something yet. The giant is back in its shop now, cooling between runs, waiting for the next tour and the next crowd. Most days it does exactly what everyone expects of an 80-year-old legend. It looks magnificent, and it hauls its handful of cars, and it lets the diesels handle the real work. But somewhere out east, on an ordinary hill under an ordinary sky, there's a stretch of rail that remembers a different evening. The night the machine they called too old, too slow, and long since finished, woke up, leaned into a load that had beaten the future, and shoved it up the grade like it was 1943 all over again. The past, it turns out, wasn't done with us. And it may not be done with us yet.